All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for staying back and not going for your toilet break or your networking session next door. As a quick recap, I'm Leng, one of the shipping partners from Most Driven Singapore. Very happy to be here. And earlier on, Abhishek actually quoted, right, from SM Lee Hsien Loong during the last, this year's Singapore Maritime Week. And I'll also like to quote from SM Lee, right? And I have the quote here. He said, "The world cannot escape turbulent times ahead, but the future of maritime is bright." And he went on to stress that if we were to plan ahead, right, and take the right steps, we can continue to thrive and do well. And I believe that this quote actually encapsulates the tension, the topics, the issues that we are here to discuss today. Singapore, as a maritime nation, sits on the crossroad of global trade. We have always faced uncertainties, turbulence, coming in from geopolitical risk. Jonathan Cole also talked about shifting trade flows. We've talked about the challenges of technology. But we haven't quite talked about the risks, like cybersecurity risk, climate risk, transition risk, as well as supply chain disruptions. But of course, Singapore Maritime, we've always had pretty long-term strategies, and we always play the long game. And one of the key things that we have done, and we have decided to do for over the past few years, is really to build the Tuas megaport, capable of handling capacity of 65 million TEUs, fully automated, right? PSC, you can see all the little autonomous guided vehicles running around and so on. It's amazing. So really, my very first question to the panelists, and we're going to have a bit of fun. Feel free to jump in, share your views, disagree, right? And please share your views on whether this massive investment is enough to put Singapore in a good position to face uncertainties. Any takers?
I'm not sure whether that's ladies first as as respect, or ladies first as see what you have to say. But good morning, everyone, and thanks to the organizers for having me on this panel today. I think looking at my fellow panelists is probably going to be quite a fun session. Is the investment going to be enough to prepare us for the future? I think, as was alluded to in the previous panel, you can either sit and do nothing and 10 years later say you should have invested, or you can take on a little bit of risk, understand what your strategic strengths are, make the investment in order to put yourself ahead of your competitors in a market. So I think that the investment in the build of the Tuas megaport is a strategic investment. I actually think it's an investment that Singapore needed to do. And I think that at least in the midterm, it will put us ahead of the competition. Ultimately, Singapore is built on very strong foundations. We have a very stable political climate, which businesses look for. We have stability and a long-term view to our policy, which again is what people look for. And the automation will ensure that our ports are run very efficiently, which is again what businesses look for. So all these things considered, I think the investment is a smart strategic one and will place us in a relatively good position. Anyone want to take the counter view?
Let me expand that a little bit. I mean, I definitely agree, but I think the question is it enough? And so I'm going to start by saying no. And I'll explain that a little bit. So I think investing in the Tuas megaport is, in many respects, it's courageous because of the volume and the extent of automation, and I think that needs to be applauded, and that's absolutely phenomenal. The reason I say no is because the investment in and of itself is one part of what is really important to do wider. I think so if I think about Tuas, at least from an outsider's view, I think in many respects it's a logical extrapolation of the bet that Singapore has taken very early on, many decades ago as well, of being a trade hub, of being able to enable and punch way above its weight from a maritime relevance perspective. At the same time, we're seeing quite a lot of developments in the near geographies as well in terms of wanting to get a better position, modernize their ports, and so on and so forth. So I think it's in that respect, it's a logical extrapolation, and like I said, it's courageous, it's phenomenal, and needs to be applauded, but it doesn't end there, and therefore not enough, because I think it's not one of those things where you put it and then you sort of stay within that small ecosystem. I think to us as such becomes a magnet for a tremendous amount of technology development. You mentioned the autonomous vehicles moving in and so on and so forth. It becomes a magnet for modern port operations. It becomes a potential topic. And I think I remember reading, perhaps it was earlier today or yesterday, on the president's visit to Egypt. And actually one of the topics was around digitalizing Egyptian ports. And I think what that does is it opens up the relationship with several geographies on a basis where you use something like Tuas as a thread to engage with other geographies on helping modernize, helping implement, and so on and so forth. Use Tuas as a magnet, as I said, to develop technology, and also then to be able to position yourself in the event of chaotic disruption. I mean, we heard earlier during COVID how it became an important, Pasir Panjang and some of the other areas became an important feature in order to decongest some of the supply chain cycles. And so, positioning infrastructure from that perspective is really important. But the reason I say it's also not enough is because we're in an era of fuel uncertainty, and therefore investments around infrastructure to develop the supporting services continually needs to continue to be made, whether it is through the service providers and their delivery capabilities, LNG barges or whatever might be the next steps, methanol and so on and so forth, whether it is SOPs and procedures, whether it is being continue to be a beacon of modern maritime regulation, because I think we're definitely in an era where even regulators need to get inspired by innovators, and so I on the previous panel I heard a lot about the need for regulation to provide that sort of inspiration for what innovation should be. I'm always a believer that similarly it's the other way around as well. We've seen many other industries and sectors where regulators are inspired and need to sandbox with innovators, and I think Singapore has that ability to be able to showcase what modern regulation could look like from a Singapore standpoint and be an ideal or a model for wider geographies to adopt, and hopefully international organizations as well.
All right, thank you.
My turn.
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
Well, Singapore built the Tuas port because they want to compete, right? And they did a very good job. We compete with the international market. We compete with Shanghai, we compete with Dubai these days. So I look at it from an external and internal angle. From external angle would be how Singapore continue to innovate. I give you one example. In the ratings of Singapore, insurance has been is a weak area. And recently, SSA, well, I got to talk about SSA, right? Launched a world's unique insurance for ship cyber, right? And also together coupled with the only balanced scorecard for ship cyber. So that is, to me, innovation. So Singapore has to continuously look outwards and look for weaknesses. Internally, I think we talk about digitalization, we talk about decarbonization. All these are all very important. But when the tough time comes, I believe at the end of the day, it's people. And I was telling people, I was telling in general that 10 years ago and 10 years now, there was no startups, no tech. We don't talk about ship cybersecurity. There was very little geopolitics. There was no decarb. And right now, we are all flooded, right? On top of having all these challenges we talked about this morning. So I believe people is extremely important, and how we can equip them, how we can, as simple as giving them sufficient knowledge in order to, for example, to pursue decarb. So Singapore, I believe, will have to focus on talent internally, at the same time look at external and see how it can continue to innovate.
Thank you, TS. Now, my panelists have actually shared quite a number of very interesting insights and thoughts. And I'd just like to pick on one that Nakul mentioned, right, about modernizing ports by our other competitors, right? And a big part of modernizing ports is actually on technology, right? And I'd like to touch on that. I think all three panelists, you've touched on, digitalization, technology, and so on. So as an element, right, one of our tools really is that Singapore Maritime has actually invested quite a bit on technology or digitalization and so on, right? And we have our maritime, digitalization plan. We have CSER. There's a Singapore, cyber index, right, that you've mentioned, TS. And we have our Digiport SG, we have DigiOcean, all these wonderful, great initiatives. Even the cybersecurity, Singapore agency, CSA, they've launched a number of initiatives like Cyber Essentials, just to encourage companies and all that to think about cybersecurity and risk as well. Can I now invite my panelists, my esteemed panelists, to share your thoughts of what are the risks and opportunities, right, when it comes to embracing technology, digitalization, as well as how are we managing our cybersecurity risk at this point in time? Are we actually still leading, or have we actually fallen behind?
Okay, ladies again. So I think, in addition to being an independent board member of Hafnia, I also work with IBM to get in the tech angle. I also recently started teaching sustainability and digitalization to the Masters in Maritime Studies course at NTU. So I think, first thing, taking a step back, I do want to say that ultimately Singapore's position is really, to my mind, premised on having a vast ecosystem play, and also prioritizing long-term over some of the risks that you might take on in the short term. I think on the people issue, if I can just respond to that, I want to say that I think through teaching at NTU, what I'm seeing is really an effort now to actually modernize the curriculum that is being introduced and thought to the next generation of potential maritime leaders, to actually push them to think about how do you address or start approaching bigger issues like decarbonization in a different way. How do you start thinking about value creation, value sharing, value amplification through some of the projects like green corridors, instead of just looking at, okay, what is my short-term profit going to be? This actually will require massive transformation, not just in the systems and processes or technology that's set up, but fundamentally as business leaders and how business leaders think about approaching these problems. It's a vast topic. In fact, you just had a full week conference last week at Impact Week talking about what transformation is necessary in order to lead moving forward. So probably not going to touch so much upon it there. I think the question that you ask is a big one. And I actually don't think that it can be answered from, just an industry level as to whether or not we are still leading. Because ultimately, the constituent parts of a country and the constituent parts of the industry are the individual companies that make up an industry. And as we've discussed many, many times before, there's no one maritime industry per se. And the biggest problem that we have when it comes to furthering adoption of new technology in the maritime industry is the long tail of small and medium-sized businesses. So if I focus first on whether as an industry is Singapore leading, I would say that, I'm proud as a Singaporean to see the steps that my government, and in particular MPA, are taking in order to drive discussions on decarbonization, building an open source data platform to let companies gain access to data in order to inform development of new technology, development of new AI models, which are actually going to be really important when we come to talk about decarbonization, and also in facilitating discussions. I'm also really proud of Singapore's role that Singapore plays in ASEAN, and Singapore will take over as the leader of ASEAN in I think in the second cycle from now, because I think that when you think about Singapore's position in this region, we cannot think about it in isolation. I think ASEAN is actually doing a lot of very interesting things, particularly on the data front and technology front, in order to help further ease of sharing of data, because ultimately when you talk about technology and decarbonization, it's all going to come to that. I think at the corporate level, we then go down to the large corporates. I think, again, there's no one size fits all. I think the corporates that have more forward-looking leadership are really taking a long, hard look at how technology can help them solidify or further their competitive edge. But you see some companies just sitting back and doing nothing. So as an industry, where do we sit? As an industry, I still think that there is a lot to be done. I think there's a lot of money that's being thrown into innovation, but are we really seeing the ROI? Is money being directed to where it needs to be directed? I do think that we need to see more transparency in that area in order to ensure that we are helping the companies that need to be helped, and we're not inadvertently creating a 2 or 3 tier markets where big corporates benefit from all the regulations and all the influx of external capital, but we're helping the long tail of shipping, which is essentially the shipping industry, also catch up to complying with regulations.
I mean, that's a tough act to follow, Suyin. That was a super comprehensive answer, and it just triggered so many thoughts from my head. So let me just add maybe a couple of different perspectives. I think it's important to just consider, what does leadership actually look like? Because if we take a look at some of the established benchmarks, Sinwa Baltic or DNV Menon and so on and so forth, Singapore is definitely, number one on a lot of different metrics, and I think that's absolutely fabulous and has been there for many years. And I think as the MPA chief exec mentioned earlier, it's likely it's because of a constant development. However, saying that, I think a couple of things that I will probably add. I think number one is that we have to be conscious of the fact that Singapore as a market in and of itself is unlikely to be big enough for any emerging business or startup or solution or whatever to be satisfied and to be viable. And therefore, I think it's a phenomenal gateway in order to be able to expand capabilities. And then the question is, in the modern environment, is that gateway regional or is it more international? And I think that's something, whether it is a gateway to capital or whether it is a gateway to customers and so on and so forth. So I think from a startup ecosystem, that's an important aspect. What it does have in its favor, which is quite fascinating, is it is a superb operational hub. I mean, if you look at the anchorage and sort of the operational activity, whilst also being able to attract, even in the maritime space, some early stage investors, strategic as well as VCs, and also now increasingly solution providers because of the tax environment in Europe or whatever it might be. We're seeing migration of founders coming in, so some level of talent availability, and I think that's an interesting mix. And then the question is, what do we do with that, and how do we nurture and take that forward is going to be an important thing. One of the concerns I do have, though, is a little bit this fracturing of the industry. I think you mentioned it in different ways, and I think earlier we talked a little bit about the prevalence of SMEs and their adoption, and I think this fracturing of the industry is something that is a strong possibility. We've got to be very cautious because large parts of the enabling and supporting service system of this industry is unlikely going to be attractive for only big corporates, and therefore small to medium enterprises have a very important mainstay in contributing to this cog moving, and for Singapore itself to be an attractive bunker center, an attractive stores, spares, crew change, and also transshipment hub. And I think that's something that I think increasingly needs to be thought through in terms of a risk of continue to be leading as well. I think the other, just one more element I'm going to add is sort of this capital aspect, and given the audience, I guess that's probably on top of mind. There's a strong focus on the asset element of capital needs around, port infrastructure, vessels, or fuel requirements. But what we're seeing is that pockets of opportunity are opening quite dramatically in terms of the service elements of it, whether it's around modernization of documentation, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it is vessel performance elements, and so on and so forth. And we're starting at least to see indications where some of those sources of capital are non-traditional to the maritime industry coming in, and relatively small in terms of what the asset placements are, but still meaningful if you take a look at digital allocations. And that's something that I think is another area or opportunity for Singapore to think about as being, continue to be an attractive capital gateway for modern solutions. It gives you a lot of opening.
No, I just wanted to add a bit on the capital point, given the audience, that if we bring it back to technology and decarbonization, a lot of times people say there's no transition without transmission, but I actually say there's no transition without finance. And to the financiers, because finance is what unlocks everything, and there are too many, with the long tail, again, talking about bankability of these clients. So I think that finance needs to rethink the way that you actually assess risk reward, and I think that maybe in some way or form, I'm not saying that all responsibility should be devolved or delegated to the government, but I think how can we actually support the SMEs in that front from a financing point of view is probably something where Singapore can take a leadership on as well. But sorry, TS?
I think tech-wise, as you all know, we are actually standing on shifting grounds, and it's shifting very fast. And I strongly believe that it is not in terms of tech, it is not where Singapore is today, but where is it going to be 3 years from now, right? AI will profoundly shift and change the industry. In fact, I was talking to McKinsey yesterday, just saying, how much productivity can the maritime industry gain from AI? The figures range from 10 to 15%. And 10 to 15% of productivity improvement is enormous. We're not even looking at how AI is going to drive your revenue. So to me, it's not where we are and how we are going to push AI adoption in the maritime industry, which are working very closely with MPA. And the other, unfortunately, is cybersecurity. The most latest, I think it was airports got hacked. And I think cybersecurity is going to be more and more significant issue, and we do not want our hands to be tied, right? So while we pursue digitalization and AI, cybersecurity will be something that we have to pay a lot of attention. SMEs host the kind of the bulk of industries. There are 1,000 ships out there every day in Singapore. And a lot of them are not here to load and unload, they're here to resupply, to get repaired, and a lot of these are handled and managed by the SMEs. So I visited 100 SME companies over the last 3 years to understand them, to work with them, and under SSA, but I also believe that technology will be the saving grace in a way to move them forward, to improve in terms of productivity. And of course, the talents within the company, how can we bring the right skill sets to them so they can, we don't have to tell how to do their business or to suck eggs, right? But what they need is a back-end skill sets and talent within the company to drive the company forward.
Thank you. Probably 5 minutes ago, I've been told that I only have 5 minutes left, unfortunately, right? And I really wanted to touch on people, but unfortunately, I'm running out of time. But I thought at this juncture, right, I'd like to borrow CE's previous words as well, right? CE spoke about agility and how Singapore actually reacted, right, during the Red Sea crisis. And I also want to bring all of us a little bit, backwards. A few years ago during the COVID maritime crisis, about how we all come together and came up with practical solutions very quickly, very responsive. And what happened was, because of the tripartite partnership, everybody came together. Singapore has always been open. We must remain open and look after our people coming in and, maintaining our status as a gateway for people to come and cross-fertilize, our thoughts, our insights, and our vision, our hopes for technology, for decarbonization, as well as how to manage risk in terms of cybersecurity risk and business risk, right? I suppose at this point in time, I don't have the opportunity to ask the audience to pose your questions and all that. Maybe you can do so during the networking lunch later. But right now, I'd like to ask each of the panelists, right, to share with me your key takeaway in a sentence. If you want something that that the audience remember from what you have just shared, what would be their one sentence? Yeah.
Including semicolons?
Up to you, Suyin.
Yeah, so I think we've spoken quite a bit about investments, finance, and the future. I think, to your point, the one thing that I mean, it's been my recent topic where I keep leaving it off at is the human element. Let's not forget that technology is just a tool. As we're pouring money into technology, let us not forget to also invest in humans and to design for humans. So let's bring human centricity back into the technology discussion.
Thank you, Suyin. I think that's a very, very important thought, because somebody just shared with me, when it comes to AI, you have narrow AI, you have generative AI, you also have intelligent AI. But however, the human element is always critical, because 0 multiplied by 1 is still 0. So you still need the human brain to get a step ahead and move things forward. Right.
Yeah, I think if I make a sentence around what you just said, I think I'm going to start by saying I think AI, we really need to think about it as augmented intelligence as opposed to artificial from a maritime context perspective. And I think on the Singapore thing, I just want to say, I think the foundation for Singapore's leadership is well established. I think that the competitive scenario in the world that we live in is evolving fast enough where we've got to constantly think about what does one step ahead look like. And I think that we've seen other maritime centers maybe fall into the trap of believing one-off or good foundations or legacy institutions are good enough to maintain leadership. I think we have lots to learn to remind ourselves that leadership is a continuous exercise.
Thank you, Nakul. Leadership, new things to do, new ways of doing things. Innovate. Thank you. Yes?
Yeah, I'm not going to end up with technology, but on a positive note, right, shipping, at times, or at most times, thrives on crisis. I think we have to remember that and just figure out how to make full use of the situation. Thank you.
Making full use of the situation. All right. So, well, the ball is now in my court, right? To make full use of the situation and quickly wrap up this panel discussion. Well, in life, turbulence and uncertainties will always come. Well, for Singapore to remain as a safe, smart, and sustainable hub, we must all learn how to anticipate, collaborate, and innovate. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and let us thank the panelists for the time the usual way.